It's strange how the stories we grew up with, full of happy endings and moral lessons, actually hide a much darker past. Most people don't realize this, but fairy tales were never meant to put children to sleep. They were created to wake them up, to warn them about the real dangers of life. These tales were soaked in blood, fear, and brutal truths that left lasting marks on the soul. These narratives were born in times when life was harsh and unpredictable. There were no charming princes fixing everything with a kiss. It was common to see children abandoned, monsters that represented real trauma, and punishments so cruel they made you shiver. It wasn't just imagination. It was how people translated fear and hope into stories. But over time, those stories got a makeover. The terror was stripped away, glitter was sprinkled on top, and the raw warnings turned into bedtime fantasies. But what if I told you that behind almost every classic tale hides a bone-chilling truth? And believe me, Red Riding Hood is only the beginning. Most people think of Red Riding Hood as a sweet cautionary tale about listening to your mother. But in its original version, this story was anything but innocent. Red is tricked into eating her own grandmother's flesh, served to her by the wolf in disguise. There's no happy ending, no woodsman to save her, just the raw horror of being manipulated and consumed by something she trusted. The wolf isn't just a creature, he's a symbol. In older European folk tales, he represents men who prey on young girls, using charm and false kindness. The disguise as the grandmother reflects how danger often hides behind familiar faces. This tale wasn't made to lull children to sleep. It was created to wake them up to the realities of life. Even the act of devouring someone held meaning. It symbolized the destruction of innocence, the loss of safety, and the permanent impact of trauma. The story screamed, "Be careful who you trust." And speaking of trust, let's talk about what really happened in the original version of Sleeping Beauty. The beautiful princess in the classic tale doesn't simply fall asleep. She becomes a silent victim. In Giambattista Basile's version, she's assaulted by a king while unconscious. The result? She wakes up not to a romantic kiss, but to the cries of her newborn twins. A fairy tale turned into a brutal allegory of abuse and injustice. This narrative wasn't trying to be charming. It was a direct commentary on how women were seen: silent, passive, and available. The idea that someone could be violated while asleep and still end up in a royal marriage shows the deeply twisted values of that era. It's not love, it's a warning about the abuse of power. The story forces us to confront something uncomfortable, that many tales we call magical were actually cries for help dressed in fantasy. It's not just disturbing, it's real. And as we shift to Hansel and Gretel, we'll see that horror didn't stop there. It only got darker. This isn't just a story about breadcrumbs and candy houses. In the original versions, Hansel and Gretel are abandoned by their parents because the family doesn't have enough food. They're sent into the forest to starve. That's not just dramatic. That was real life for many during famines in Europe. It's a story born from the stomach's pain. Then comes the witch. Not just an evil character, but a figure that represents desperation turned monstrous. She feeds the children, only to fatten them up and eat them. Cannibalism again, but this time as a symbol of corrupted nurture. A motherly figure turned predator. The oven she uses, it wasn't just for baking. It was a metaphorical hell, the fate waiting for the unwanted. This tale is about betrayal at every level, by parents, by society, by hope itself. It taught children to be cunning, not trusting, and it prepared them for a world where survival depended on being sharper than your circumstances. Just wait until you hear what the Three Little Pigs originally taught about violence and vengeance. You might remember this one as a tale about hard work and preparation. But early versions of the Three Little Pigs were far more brutal. The wolf doesn't just blow down houses, he eats the pigs, one by one, often in gruesome detail, and when the final pig fights back, it's not through clever tricks, it's through outright violence and revenge. In some versions, the surviving pig boils the wolf alive. Yes, there's no lesson in patience or discipline, only a raw message. Destroy your enemies before they destroy you. The story paints a world where being nice gets you killed, and only brutality ensures survival. It flips the modern message completely on its head. The siblings' lack of unity is another dark layer. Instead of helping each other, they act selfishly and pay the price. This wasn't about teamwork. It was a grim reminder that weakness invites disaster. And while this might sound extreme, the real inspiration behind Beauty and the Beast might shock you even more. We often think of Beauty and the Beast as a tender story of learning to love beyond appearances. But the origin is far more unsettling. The Beast, what might just ugly, he was cursed because he dared to reject the advances of a fairy. In other words, he was punished not for doing wrong, but for saying no. That's a very different kind of message. But there's more. The real-life inspiration behind the Beast is believed to be Pedro Gonzalez, a man born with a rare condition that covered his body with hair. He was treated like an animal, exhibited in courts, and only found love through arranged marriage. His life was seen as beastly, not because of who he was, but because of how others viewed him. The story doesn't ask you to look past someone's looks. It demands that you consider how society creates monsters out of the misunderstood. And as time passed, many of these hard truths were sanded down, reshaped into bedtime stories. But how exactly did this transformation happen? The gruesome truths in these tales didn't disappear. They were rewritten. As publishing became more widespread in the 19th century, especially with the Brothers Grimm and Charles Perrault, the stories were cleaned up. No more bloody endings, no more uncomfortable themes, just neat little morals tied with a ribbon. Why the change? Society shifted. Childhood was beginning to be seen as a time of innocence, not preparation for survival. So tales of death, betrayal, and starvation were replaced with songs, dances, and princes. But even then, traces of the original lessons remained, like ghosts trapped between the lines. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It reflected a growing desire to protect children, or at least pretend to. But if we peel back the pages and read between the lines, the warnings are still there, whispering. And to understand them fully, we have to look at what shaped these stories in the first place: history and survival. These stories didn't come from nowhere. They were shaped by plagues, famine, war, and oppression. When people didn't have enough to eat, they told stories about cannibal witches. When women had no rights, they created silent heroines. Every narrative was a product of its time, a reflection of pain, fear, and desperate hope. Folktales were survival guides wrapped in fiction. They were whispered warnings about strangers, hunger, violence, and misplaced trust. Not just entertainment. They were tools. Tools to teach, to process, to endure. And because of that, they carried layers that only the wise could decipher. Understanding the roots of these tales isn't just an academic exercise. It's a reminder that culture evolves through fear and resilience. But there's one more twist. Some of these terrifying tales weren't even fiction. They were based on real people and events. Let's go back to Pedro Gonzalez. His story wasn't born in fantasy. It was born in cruelty. He was labeled a beast for looking different, locked away, and mocked. His existence inspired the idea that a person's worth is judged by how well they can pass as normal. That's not a fairy tale. That's a tragedy with a polite mask. In other cases, like Hansel and Gretel, some historians believe the story was inspired by real reports of famine so severe that people turned to cannibalism. Yes, actual markets were rumored to sell human flesh during certain historical crises. These weren't just tales told around the fire. They were how people processed horror without losing their minds. These dark echoes of real life made the stories more than stories. They were emotional survival kits. And yet, somehow, they became nursery rhymes. So, how did society decide these were fit for children? Let's bring it all together. So here we are, centuries later, reading sugar-coated versions of what were once grim survival lessons. The stories were changed not to erase the past, but to hide it, to protect innocence, or maybe to sell more books. But every line still carries the weight of history, if you know where to look. We teach kids to beware of wolves, but we forget to explain what the wolves really are. We talk about magic, but never about the monsters it was made to fight. Maybe it's time to stop seeing fairy tales as bedtime stories and start seeing them for what they were: ancient armor dressed in fantasy. What other stories do you think have a darker past than you imagined? And what would happen if we started telling the truth again? Stick around, because this rabbit hole goes even deeper. Now that you've seen the true face behind the fairy tales, let me ask you, how many other stories have you blindly believed your whole life? How much of what we call innocent is actually just a rewritten version of something much darker? Something people once told in whispers, not lullabies. Maybe it is time we stop protecting ourselves from uncomfortable truths and start questioning what has been passed down to us. Because behind every tale there's a purpose, a warning, a truth no one dared to say out loud. And once you know that, can you really go back to hearing these stories the same way again? If this opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment. Tell me which story shocked you the most, or share a dark version of a tale you grew up with. And of course, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because there's another video waiting for you right now on the screen. Watch it next, and let us keep uncovering the hidden side of the stories we thought we knew.